Today, we're diving into a fascinating interpretive tool. You could almost call it a kind of ancient code that's hidden in plain sight within the Bible. It's a key that connects stories written centuries apart, and honestly, once you see how it works, it might just change the way you read the entire book.
So let's just start with this puzzle, a question that's fascinated people for literally millennia. You've got this massive collection of texts written across different cultures, different languages, different eras. So how on earth can all these pieces possibly fit together to tell one single unified story?
Well, the answer feels a little bit like we're in a detective story. The idea is that the Old Testament is just filled with these clues. People, major historical events, even religious rituals that all seem to be pointing or hinting at something much, much bigger that's still to come.
And this isn't some modern theory somebody cooked up. The biblical authors themselves were convinced these connections weren't just random coincidences. They saw them as part of a divine plan, a single grand story that was intentionally unfolding over a long, long time.
Okay. So what is the key that unlocks all these connections? How do we actually go about deciphering this code? It all comes down to this powerful concept called typology.
In simple terms, typology is this idea that God embedded patterns throughout history. The original pattern, and this is important, it has to be a real historical person, place, or event, is called a type. You can think of it as a foreshadowing. And it points to a future, much greater fulfillment, which we call the antitype.
So, you can't just call any similarity a type. The scholar Greg Beale laid out a kind of 5-point checklist. First, there has to be a clear parallel. But critically, the type has to be historical. It really happened. It was also designed to point forward, to foreshadow a fulfillment that is way greater in significance. That's the escalation part. And here's the kicker. Often, the full connection only becomes crystal clear in retrospect. When you're looking back from that fulfillment.
And this quote really gets to the heart of it. This whole method is not a modern invention. The New Testament authors themselves were the ones using typology to connect the dots. It was their way of explaining how Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment, the antitype of everything that had come before.
All right, so that's the theory. But what does this actually look like in practice? Well, the Bible itself gives us this really powerful metaphor to help us get it. It's the difference between a shadow and the real thing.
So types and antitypes are often described as a shadow and a substance. A shadow, it's not the real thing, right? But it gives you a true outline of it. It's kind of like how a map isn't the city, but it definitely helps you get around. The type is that temporary shadow, and it's pointing to the permanent, real substance.
And you see this idea captured perfectly in this verse from the book of Hebrews. It says the Old Testament law was like a shadow, giving a rough outline of the good things to come. But it wasn't the true form. It wasn't the actual substance, which would only be revealed later on.
So you could say that every type is doing two jobs at once. On one level, it has a real, immediate historical purpose. Animal sacrifices, for example, were a very real part of the Old Testament law for a reason. But on a second level, they also acted as a kind of prophetic clue, teaching a lesson about a future, perfect sacrifice.
Okay, so now that we have the key, let's unlock a couple of examples and see exactly how the New Testament authors put this code into action. All right, clue number 1. In the Old Testament book of Exodus, God miraculously provides something called manna, which is basically a bread from heaven to keep the people of Israel alive while they're wandering in the wilderness. It was real, physical food for a real, physical journey. But then, centuries later in the New Testament, Jesus comes along and completely reinterprets this event. He says that the manna was a type, a shadow, that pointed to himself. He is the true bread from heaven, the spiritual food that gives eternal life, not just temporary physical life. You see the escalation there? From physical to spiritual, temporary to eternal.
Here's our second clue. Remember that story where the Israelites are dying of thirst in the desert and water just miraculously starts flowing from a rock to give them a drink? It was another real, physical event that solved a very real physical problem.
And sure enough, again, we see a New Testament author, this time the Apostle Paul, making the connection explicit. He just comes right out and says that the physical rock was a type that pointed to a spiritual reality, Christ himself, the true source of spiritual life. The rock was the shadow. Christ was the substance.
But once you start seeing these patterns everywhere, a huge question comes up. It's not about if these connections exist, but about their nature. And how you answer that one question leads to a major fork in the road for theology.
And the crucial point is this. By the 17th century, the debate among theologians wasn't if typology was real. They all agreed on that. They were debating its nature. Just how different is the shadow from the substance, really?
So this really breaks down the two main views. The first view saw the change as quantitative. The analogy they used was a boy growing into a man. It's the same substance, right? It's just a new, more developed form. But the second view saw it as qualitative. For them, the analogy was a shadow being replaced by the actual body. They argued these are fundamentally different things, not just more of the same.
John Owen, who was a key voice for that second view, argued that the Old Covenant was made up entirely of these shadows. And for him, that meant people were saved under that system by trusting the promise of what was to come, but they weren't saved by the system itself. Why? Because the shadows could point to forgiveness, but they couldn't actually provide it.
And this is not just some dusty academic debate, not at all. This single interpretive difference, whether it's more of the same or a total shadow to substance shift, directly shapes how different Christian denominations today view core practices like baptism, who can be a church member, and the very nature of God's relationship with humanity.
So, typology really gives us a new lens, a key for seeing a single, unified story of redemption that's woven through the Bible from beginning to end. And the question that leaves us with is this: now that you have this key, what other shadows, what other patterns might you start to see pointing toward a greater substance in the stories you thought you knew so well?